Racist waiter angrily poured hot tea on an elderly black woman, not knowing she's his boss's long-lost mother. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Walter Bishop's office, casting a warm, golden hue across the room. His office, much like the restaurant he had built, was the epitome of elegance. The rich, polished mahogany desk stood as the centerpiece, its smooth surface gleaming under the light. Behind him, walls adorned with framed certificates of excellence, photographs of famous faces who had dined at Le Grand Étoile, and accolades from renowned culinary institutions filled the space. Yet amidst all the luxury, the opulence, and the praise, Walter's gaze was fixed on a single framed photo, one that seemed out of place among the other grand displays of his success. In the photograph, a boy no older than 5 grinned brightly, his eyes full of innocence and happiness, clinging to the hand of a woman. Her face, soft and nurturing, was that of Margaret, Walter's mother. She looked every bit the doting parent, her expression one of pure joy, her hand resting protectively on young Walter's shoulder. That photo was taken long before his life changed forever, before the cruel twist of fate that had torn them apart. Walter traced his finger lightly over the glass of the frame, his face betraying none of the inner turmoil he felt. But his eyes told a different story. There, behind the steel facade of his calm exterior, was a deep, aching void. Decades had passed since Margaret's disappearance, yet the pain of that loss remained as raw as ever. It was a silent torment, a wound that never fully healed. He had spent years searching for her, hoping against hope that one day she would walk back into his life. But each day that passed without her only deepened the chasm in his heart. And now, despite all the wealth, all the success, he felt incomplete. A man who owned everything except the one thing that mattered most. Le Grand Étoile was his masterpiece, a restaurant that represented not just culinary excellence, but the height of sophistication. The elite of the city dined here, the powerful, the famous, the wealthy. Walter had poured his heart and soul into creating a space that transcended fine dining, a place where every detail was meticulously crafted to perfection. Yet, with all that he had accomplished, there was a bitter irony in his triumph. He had built this empire, gained fame, and accumulated fortune, but the very person he had built it for, the one person whose pride and love he had longed for, was not there to share it with him. Walter exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His eyes lingered on the photo for a moment longer before he set it down gently on the desk. He wondered, not for the first time, what his mother would think if she could see him now. Would she be proud of the man he had become? Or would she be saddened by the emptiness that still haunted him, the void she had left behind? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Emily, his trusted assistant, entered the room cautiously, sensing the heavy atmosphere that seemed to hang around her boss like a shroud. Emily is also his girlfriend, and she knew Walter better than most. She knew his pain, though he rarely spoke of it, and she had long since learned not to ask too many questions. She respected the silence he carried, the unspoken sorrow that lingered beneath his composed exterior. "Walter," she said gently, her voice breaking the stillness of the room, "the evening rush is about to start. Just wanted to remind you." Walter blinked, as if pulled back from some far-off place, and turned his attention to her. His face remained stoic, as always, but Emily could see the distant look in his eyes. He had been thinking about her again, his mother. Emily didn't have to ask to know. She had seen that look many times before. "Thank you, Emily," Walter replied, his voice calm and measured, though there was an unmistakable edge of weariness in it. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, as if considering saying something more, but she decided against it. She nodded, offering him a small, sympathetic smile before retreating back through the door. She knew the story, as did most of the staff, but it was not something anyone dared to discuss. Walter's grief was private, almost sacred in its intensity. He had learned to live with it, to carry it with quiet dignity, but it was always there, like a shadow that followed him no matter how bright the lights of his success shone. Once the door closed behind Emily, Walter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. His gaze returned to the photo, and for a moment, his stoic mask cracked just enough for the sadness to slip through. He sighed deeply, whispering into the empty room, "Where are you, Mom?" The only response was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that seemed to mock the years that had slipped by without her. Walter straightened in his chair, pulling himself together once more. There were duties to attend to, customers to please, a restaurant to run. But the pain of the past remained, a constant companion that no amount of success could ever erase. And so, with a heavy heart, Walter stood from his desk, ready to face another night of business as usual. But in the quiet corners of his soul, the search for his mother continued, even as the years stretched on, and the hope of finding her grew dimmer. Yet, unknown to Walter, fate was about to intervene in ways he could never have imagined. Inside a dimly lit, modest apartment, the air inside feels heavy, as though the weight of decades of hardship has settled into the walls. Old furniture, worn but carefully maintained, surrounds Margaret, telling stories of a life lived in fragments. The space is cluttered yet organized, a quiet reflection of a mind that clings to the past even as it fades. Margaret, now an elderly woman, sits at a small, rickety kitchen table. Her face, weathered by time and sorrow, holds a certain dignity. Her hands, once young and strong, now tremble slightly as she thumbs through a worn photo album. Each page reveals pieces of a life she can barely recall, images of a young boy, her son, smiling at a park, on his first day of school, on his birthday. But the memories are hazy, like distant echoes that no longer reach her clearly. She traces her finger over the image of the boy she once knew, his name, Walter, feeling foreign on her lips. Her apartment is filled with relics from her forgotten past. On the dusty shelves rest trinkets, old letters, and photographs. The ticking of an old clock fills the quiet room, its sound eerily loud against the backdrop of her silence. Margaret's life, much like the objects around her, has become a series of disjointed fragments, pieces of a puzzle that don't seem to fit together anymore. Margaret's days are spent in a routine that barely holds her fragile existence together. She keeps her small apartment neat, as if the act of organizing her physical space will help her organize the scattered remnants of her mind. Her clothes are threadbare but clean, her shoes worn down from years of walking through life's unforgiving streets. Every movement she makes is slow and deliberate, the weight of the years pressing on her frail body. Flashback. Margaret, younger, vibrant, and full of life, is seen walking through a park with her young son, Walter. He's no more than 6 years old, his laughter filling the air as he runs ahead to chase a ball. Margaret smiles, her heart full of pride and love as she watches him. The sun is bright, and the world feels alive with possibilities. But then the scene shifts. Margaret is in a hospital bed, confused, her head bandaged. The room spins around her as she tries to remember what happened. Voices blur. Faces she doesn't recognize move in and out of focus. Her memory is fragmented, shattered by the accident that stole her past and her identity. She reaches out, calling for Walter, but no one answers. Days turn into weeks, and weeks into months. Margaret is lost in a fog of amnesia, barely aware of her surroundings. Her husband, Mr. Bishop, visits only once, standing cold and distant at the foot of her bed. He looks at her with contempt, as though she is a burden he never wanted. He offers no comfort, no warmth, only a few cruel words before leaving her behind. "Margaret, you're not the woman I'm married anymore," he says flatly. "I can't deal with this. You'll have to manage on your own." And just like that, he abandons her. The man who once promised to stand by her side in sickness and in health turns his back on her when she needs him most. Margaret's heart breaks, but the pieces are scattered, just like her memories. She is left alone in a cold, unfamiliar world, struggling to piece together the shattered fragments of her life. Present day. Back in her small apartment, Margaret opens her eyes, the painful flashback still lingering in her mind. She exhales softly, her breath shaky. The years of hardship have dulled the sharp edges of her memories, but the pain is still there, buried deep within her. She lifts her hand to her temple, rubbing gently as if to soothe the fog that never fully clears. Margaret's life, after the accident, has been one of survival. Without a family to turn to, she has learned to scrape by on meager earnings, doing odd jobs and relying on the kindness of strangers. There were moments, brief flashes, when she thought she remembered Walter, her son, her baby. But those moments were always fleeting, and with each passing year, she convinced herself that he had moved on without her, that he had grown up, built a life, and forgotten about the mother who disappeared from his world. There were times when Margaret wanted to go back, to search for her son, but the shame of her condition held her back. How could she return to a life she no longer recognized, to a son who had likely moved on? The weight of her guilt and the fear of rejection kept her hidden in the shadows, living a quiet, invisible life. As she sits at her kitchen table, a single tear rolls down her cheek, but Margaret doesn't wipe it away. She stares at the photograph of small Walter in her hand, whispering his name into the silence of her apartment, hoping, if only for a moment, that somewhere out there, he remembers her too. This day is Margaret's birthday. For years, her existence had been one of silent endurance, barely making ends meet, stretching every dollar, and choosing between necessities. She had carried on quietly, never seeking more than what was needed to survive. But today, something inside her stirred, a desire that she hadn't felt in a long time, a need to remind herself that she still mattered, that despite the years of hardship, she deserved a moment of dignity. In the drawer by her bedside, she kept a small, worn envelope. Inside were the remnants of what little savings she had managed to hold onto over the years. For decades, she had scrimped and saved, stashing away a few dollars at a time, never knowing what it was for. Just that one day, she might need it. Today felt like that day. Margaret sighed, sitting on the edge of her bed, her gnarled hands trembling slightly as she counted the bills. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for one meal. One night where she could sit in a nice restaurant and pretend, just for a moment, that life had turned out differently. She didn't need extravagance, just a warm meal, a pleasant atmosphere, and the chance to feel human again. Her eyes drifted to the old coat hanging on the back of the door. It was faded and frayed at the edges, a far cry from the fashionable items she once wore, but it was hers. She had worn it through countless winters, countless hardships, and today it would carry her through something else. Hope. Margaret dressed herself with quiet dignity, buttoning her coat and smoothing out the wrinkles as best she could. She checked her reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall, a flicker of sadness in her eyes as she saw the deep lines etched across her face. Lines of age, of pain, of stories untold. But beneath the weariness, there was a spark of something unbroken. Her dignity had been chipped away over the years, but it had never been shattered. She grabbed her purse, the one she had owned for decades, and placed the money inside carefully. Each step she took toward the door was a reminder of the weight she had carried all these years. But today, her steps felt lighter. Today, she was doing something for herself. As she stepped out of her apartment and into the brisk evening air, the world felt different. The city was alive with energy, people bustling about, lights flickering in storefronts, cars honking in the distance. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her breath visible in the cool air, but she didn't shiver. She had weathered much worse. The streets were busy, as always, but Margaret walked with purpose. She had no idea where she was headed exactly, only that she wanted something special, a place where she could sit and feel like someone again. She didn't know the name of the restaurant, but she had heard whispers in the city. Le Grand Étoile, they called it. Fancy, elegant, a place for the rich and powerful. Margaret wasn't rich, and she certainly wasn't powerful. But tonight she wanted to taste that world, even if only for a moment. As she made her way down the crowded streets, no one paid her much attention. She was just another elderly woman, blending into the background of the city's constant hum. But Margaret walked with her head held high, her back straight despite the years of burdens. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something given. It was something you carried within, even when the world tried to take it from you. She passed by shop windows displaying things she could never afford, people hurrying in and out of stores, arms full of bags. It didn't bother her, not anymore. She had stopped longing for material things long ago. What she wanted now was simpler, respect, warmth, and a quiet moment of peace. As she neared the corner where Le Grand Étoile stood, she could see the soft glow of its lights, the elegant figures moving inside. The restaurant exuded an air of exclusivity, of luxury, of a world far removed from the one she lived in. But tonight, Margaret was determined. This was her moment. She would step inside, sit at a table, and for just one evening, she would allow herself to forget the years of pain, the years of being forgotten. Little did she know that beyond those grand doors, her past and future were about to collide. The lobby of Le Grand Étoile gleamed under soft golden lights, casting an elegant glow over the velvet drapes and polished marble floors. It was a sanctuary of refinement, where the wealthy dined and the elite mingled, an atmosphere heavy with quiet luxury. But as Margaret stepped through the doors, her worn shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor, a ripple of unease followed her. The elegance of the place seemed at odds with her simple attire, the years of hardship evident in her hunched shoulders and tired eyes. She moved slowly, taking in the opulence, as if trying to absorb its warmth into her very soul. And then there was Simon. Simon, the head waiter, stood behind the counter, sharp in his crisp, tailored uniform, a picture of smug superiority. His eyes, cold and condescending, landed on Margaret the moment she entered. He didn't need to ask who she was or why she was here. To him, it was clear. The way she walked, the clothes that hung loosely on her frame, the quiet dignity in her posture. It all screamed poverty to Simon. And in his world, poverty had no place at Le Grand Étoile. He allowed himself a small sneer, masking it with a polished smile as she approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite. Margaret, ever gentle, nodded and smiled. "I have a reservation," she said softly, her voice as delicate as the air around them. Under the name Margaret, Simon didn't even glance at the reservation list. His lips curled slightly, a thinly veiled mockery. "I'm afraid there are no tables available," he replied flatly, with a dismissive wave of his hand, as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Margaret's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She had faced much worse in her life, endured slights far sharper than a waiter's disdain. She straightened herself slightly, though it took effort, and asked again, her tone as polite as ever. "Could you please check the list? I reserved a table yesterday." Simon sighed, louder this time, an exaggerated display of impatience. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though it was filled with venom. "I told you," he spat, "there are no tables available. You should try somewhere else." His eyes flicked dismissively over her clothes, her worn shoes. It wasn't just that there were no tables. It was that he had already decided she didn't belong here. Margaret's heart ached with the familiar sting of being cast aside. She had seen that look before, heard that tone more times than she cared to remember. It was the same tone used by those who believed they were better, more deserving. And yet, she didn't lash out, didn't crumble under his words. She had long learned that her dignity wasn't something others could take from her. But Simon couldn't resist. He wanted her to feel the weight of her exclusion, to know that in this world of silver spoons and velvet curtains, she didn't measure up. "Maybe this isn't your kind of place," he added with a smirk, loud enough now for nearby patrons to hear. Their whispers began, some watching the scene with discomfort, others avoiding her gaze altogether. The tension thickened, but still, Margaret remained calm. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "but I'll wait for the manager." That caught Simon off guard. His smile faltered, the arrogance slipping for just a moment. But he recovered quickly, crossing his arms with a smirk that showed he believed he was in control. He didn't know who she was, didn't care to know. To him, she was just another poor, elderly black woman out of her depth, trying to sit at a table meant for people with real value. He had no idea how wrong he was. Walter stood at the window of his office, overlooking the bustling dining area below. He could sense something was off, a shift in the usual serene atmosphere of his beloved restaurant. The faint murmur of discomfort and the subtle ripple of unease spread through the room like a low tide. His sharp eyes scanned the scene until they landed on the source of the disturbance, Simon. The waiter, standing stiff and smug, towered over an elderly woman. Her clothes, though worn and faded, were clean, and her posture exuded a quiet dignity despite the shabby appearance. Walter's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. There was something oddly familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. He didn't need to hear the word Simon was saying to recognize the tension in the air. He could see it in the tightness of Simon's posture, the condescension in his eyes, and the nervous glances from the surrounding patrons. With a sigh of quiet frustration, Walter decided to intervene. Striding into the dining area with an air of authority, Walter's presence alone commanded attention. As he neared the scene, he caught the tail end of Simon's curt dismissal of the elderly woman. It made his blood run cold. There was no mistaking the tone, that casual disdain. Simon wasn't just refusing to serve her. He was degrading her, looking at her as if she had no right to exist in such an elegant place. Without hesitation, Walter stepped between them, his face calm, but his voice firm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet authority. Simon stiffened, his usual arrogance faltering in the presence of his boss. "Oh, nothing to worry about, sir. This woman was just—" But Walter didn't let him finish. His focus was entirely on the woman before him. "I apologize for any inconvenience," he said gently, his voice softening. "Please allow me to show you to a table." He offered her a warm smile, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of recognition passed through him again. Something in her eyes, her face. But the thought slipped away as quickly as it had come. Margaret, taken aback by the sudden kindness, blinked up at him. She had been ready to leave, to escape the humiliation. But here was a man, not just any man, but the owner of the restaurant, showing her the respect she had been denied. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken that she couldn't quite grasp. Simon, watching this unfold, sulked in the background, his annoyance barely concealed. He shot a resentful glance at Margaret, as if blaming her for his embarrassment. Walter, however, paid him no mind. His focus remained on the woman, treating her with the dignity she deserved. As Walter gently led Margaret to a table, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he knew her from somewhere. But for now, he brushed it aside. He had always prided himself on the respect and care his restaurant offered its patrons, and this was no exception. He pulled out a chair for her, ensuring she was comfortable, and with a final nod of reassurance, left her to enjoy her meal. Margaret sat there, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. She watched Walter walk away, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and something close to longing. She didn't know his name, didn't know he was the son she had lost so long ago, but somehow, his presence filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. In the background, Simon fumed silently, his bitterness festering as the dining area returned to its usual hum of activity. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm of emotions was brewing, one that would soon bring the truth to light, changing everything. As Margaret sits at the table Walter arranged for her, a wave of emotion begins to swell inside her. The warmth of the restaurant, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of conversation surround her, but none of that compares to the unexpected kindness Walter had shown her. There was something in his eyes, a quiet respect, a gentleness she had not felt in so long, and it touched her deeply. For the first time in decades, Margaret feels a connection, a faint link to her past, a fleeting sense of something long lost but somehow familiar. Her heart aches, not with the sharp pain of sorrow, but with a bittersweet nostalgia. She sits there, absorbing it all, her weathered hands resting on the edge of the table, the weight of years pressing down on her. As Margaret finishes her meal, preparing to leave the restaurant that had unexpectedly stirred something deep within her, she steps outside. There, standing just by the doorway, is old Bob, an elderly man who had served Walter's family for years, now working at Le Grand Etoile. His eyes widen in shock as he recognizes her. Though time has weathered her face and the years have been unkind, there is no mistaking her. He had known Margaret since the days when Walter was just a boy, long before everything fell apart. "Margaret, is it really you?" Bob's voice trembles as he steps toward her, disbelief flooding his every word. Margaret turns, her heart pounding, and as she looks into old Bob's familiar eyes, "I'm sure you've met your son." The kind young man who had shown her such respect was her son. Margaret's breath catches, and her legs feel weak beneath her. Tears spring to her eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had just seen her son, the boy she had lost, now grown into a man she hardly recognized, yet whose soul was unmistakably familiar. "Bob," she manages to whisper, tears streaming down her face. "It's him, isn't it? My Walter. My son." Her voice breaks as the memories flood back. Memories of the accident, of the years spent searching for a way back to her old life. only to be kept away by Mr. Bishop, her husband, and Walter's father, who had long abandoned her. Bob gently confirms what she already knows, his own voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Margaret," he says, his voice soft but steady. "That was your boy, Walter. He's been looking for you all his life, though he never found you." Margaret's sobs grow deeper as the weight of her lost years crushes her. She remembers the day she left, the tragic accident, and the years that followed, where her husband kept her away, convinced she was too broken, too lost to return. She had spent so many years believing Walter had moved on, that he had forgotten her. Yet here he was, a successful man, a good man, one who had grown up without her, but had never stopped searching for her, despite all the lies he had been told. I can't go back to him now, Bob," Margaret chokes out between sobs. "Look at me. I'm nothing but a burden. He's built this beautiful life without me. He doesn't need me now." Old Bob places a gentle hand on her shoulder, his weathered face filled with sympathy. "Margaret, he never stopped needing you. You're his mother." But Margaret shakes her head, wiping away her tears with trembling hands. "No, Bob. He's better off without me. I don't want to ruin what he's made for himself. He's happy. He deserves to stay happy." Bob, torn between his loyalty to both mother and son, tries to persuade her otherwise, but Margaret remains firm. She feels she's already caused too much pain and doesn't want to stir the past any further. She thanks Bob for raising Walter, for being there when she couldn't, for watching over her boy. Her words are heavy with gratitude and sorrow, her heart breaking even as she tries to convince herself it's for the best. Nearby, seated quietly at the corner of the outdoor seating area, Emily, Walter's girlfriend, watches the entire scene unfold. Her eyes widen as she overhears Margaret's trembling voice, and the puzzle pieces begin to fall into place. The emotions, the way old Bob speaks to Margaret, the things she says about her son, it all suddenly makes sense. Emily's heart races as realization dawns. The woman who just left the restaurant isn't just any guest. She's Walter's mother, the one he spent his whole life searching for, the one he thought he'd lost forever. Without wasting another second, Emily rushes back inside, her footsteps quickening as she approaches Walter's office. Her heart is pounding, the urgency of the moment overwhelming her as she knocks on the door, barely able to contain the truth she has just uncovered. "Walter," she says breathlessly, "the woman who just left, I think she's your mother." Old Bob's outside talking to her. "You have to go. Now." The weight of Emily's words hits Walter like a storm, his world shifting in an instant as he rushes toward the door, a flood of hope and fear rising within him. The air in La Grande Etoile felt thick with the weight of realization. Walter stood frozen for a split second, his mind racing with the possibility that the woman he had just unknowingly served was, in fact, his long-lost mother. A flood of emotions surged within him, shock, disbelief, and hope, colliding all at once. He bolted out of the restaurant, heart pounding, every step driven by the desperate need for answers. But as Walter pushed through the front doors, his breath caught in his throat. There, at the curb, Margaret was getting into a cab, the doors shut, and in an instant, the vehicle pulled away from the sidewalk, slipping through the bustling city streets. A surge of panic hit him. She was leaving again. His mother, the woman he had searched for, was slipping away from him for a second time. Desperation gripped him. He spun around, eyes wild, searching for old Bob. The elderly man, standing just outside, was wiping tears from his weathered face, his body trembling with the emotion of the moment. Walter rushed to him, his voice barely holding together. "Bob? Bob, is it true? Is she my mother?" Old Bob's voice cracked, a lifetime of loyalty and secrets breaking through his defenses. His voice shook as he spoke. "Yes, Walter. That's her. It's Margaret, your mother." Walter felt the ground fall out from beneath him. His mother had been alive, living, breathing, within reach. And now, she was gone again. He didn't think. He didn't pause. The only thing on his mind was catching up to her, seeing her, holding her. He raced to his car, flung the door open, and without hesitation, Emily and old Bob scrambled into the back seats. The engine roared to life as Walter pressed the pedal down, the car surging forward into the busy traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of the cab. "I can't lose her. Not again," he whispered under his breath, a prayer, a plea, a desperate wish. As they weaved through the city streets, the tension grew unbearable. The cab was just ahead, moving at a steady pace, unaware of the chase that had begun behind it. Emily, sitting in the passenger's seat, glanced at Walter, seeing the raw determination etched across his face. Old Bob sat quietly in the back, tears still streaming down his face as years of secrets unraveled in his mind. Suddenly, sirens wailed behind them. The flashing lights of a police car filled the rearview mirror, but Walter didn't slow down. His mind was too focused, too driven by the singular goal of reaching his mother. The police car sped up behind them, honking and flashing its lights, demanding that Walter pull over. But Walter's foot pressed harder on the gas. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. Emily's voice was steady but urgent. "Walter, they're going to stop us." Walter's eyes never left the road. "I don't care. I have to get to her. I have to." The chase intensified. The cab, oblivious to the chaos behind it, kept moving steadily, and Walter's car closed the distance, weaving dangerously through traffic. Every second felt like an eternity. Walter's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the rhythm of the ticking clock. Time slipping away, the past slipping away, his mother slipping away. Closer, closer. The cab was just ahead now, only a few cars between them. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His breath came in shallow gasps as the police continued to follow, their sirens blaring. But Walter didn't slow, couldn't slow. Just as they approached a traffic light, Walter made his move. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he swung the car into the next lane, overtaking the cab. The tires screeched as he skidded to a halt, blocking the cab's path. The driver slammed on his brakes, the car lurching to a stop just inches from Walter's. The cab driver, bewildered, shouted in confusion. Walter jumps out of the car, his heart racing faster than his feet could ever carry him. His voice breaks with years of unspoken pain and longing. "Mom?" The word escapes his lips, trembling, filled with all the years of searching, hoping, and wondering. Inside the cab, Margaret freezes. Her hands, weathered and trembling, clutch the seat. For a moment, she wonders if her mind is playing tricks on her. This voice, this urgent cry, was it real? Slowly, she turns around, her eyes wide, and there he is, her son, standing before her, no longer the boy she remembered but a man she thought she had lost forever. The world seems to stop for both of them. Time itself feels irrelevant, as though all the years between them collapse into this single, overwhelming moment. Walter takes a few shaky steps toward her, his tears flowing freely now, each step feeling heavier with the weight of a lifetime of missed embraces, missed conversations, and missed love. Margaret's face crumples, the years of silent suffering, shame, and heartache breaking through her calm exterior. She whispers, almost to herself, "Walter," the name she had whispered in her dreams for years, the name that had been the last anchor to her past life. And then, without another thought, they embrace. It is not the careful hug of strangers, but the desperate, all-encompassing embrace of a mother and her son, reunited after decades of separation. They hold on to each other, as if letting go might mean losing everything all over again. Tears stream down their faces, tears of grief for the years lost, of relief that they have found each other, and of joy that words can't capture. The world around them fades away. Nothing but the warmth of that embrace seems to matter. Walter sobs, his voice breaking as he whispers, "I never stopped looking for you, Mom. I never stopped." Margaret, her voice shaking, whispers back, "I'm so sorry. I thought I lost you. I thought you had moved on." Her heart aches, but in this moment, the pain feels lighter, shared between them. Just then, the screeching tires of the police cars pulling up break the spell. The officers rush out, their hands ready to act, but they pause when they see what's happening. One officer lowers his hand from his holster, confused, until old Bob, with a tearful smile, tells them the truth, explaining the reunion they have just witnessed. The officers, professional as ever, still issue Walter a speeding ticket, though their eyes betray the emotion they feel. One of them even wipes a tear as he hands over the citation, whispering, "I'm sorry, sir, but you still broke the law." But Walter only smiles through his tears, nodding in understanding. The officers share a knowing look, offering silent respect, and with a brief salute, they leave the family to their moment. As the police drive off, the cab driver, who had been watching the whole scene unfold with wide eyes, finally speaks up. Still shaking and bewildered, he blurts out, "I don't know what's going on here, but I need my money." His voice, comically distressed, breaks the intensity of the moment. Emily, laughing through her own tears, quickly reaches into her purse and hands him twice the fare. "Here, for your trouble," she says, smiling warmly. The cab driver stares at the money, then at the scene before him. His own eyes glisten with unshed tears as he watches the group drive away, a strange mixture of joy and confusion swirling inside him. And as they disappear into the distance, he sits in his cab for a long while, thinking about the family he's just seen reunited, wondering about the years they lost, and realizing, maybe for the first time, how important family truly is. In the quiet sanctuary of Walter's apartment, the atmosphere is thick with emotion. Margaret sits on the couch, her frail hands resting on her lap, the years of hardship etched into the lines of her face. She looks around, taking in the grandeur of the space, but her heart is heavy. Across from her, Walter leans forward, his eyes filled with both disbelief and joy. The silence between them is poignant, filled with unspoken words that have lingered in the air for decades. Finally, Margaret begins to speak, her voice trembling with the weight of her memories. She shares the story of her disappearance, the accident that shattered her life, and the cruelty of Walter's father, who abandoned her when she was most vulnerable. Her words come slowly at first, as if she's still piecing together the fragments of a life that had once felt so distant. She tells Walter about the memory loss that plagued her for years, and how she wandered through life, hoping to remember, hoping to find her way back to him, yet feeling too broken to return. With each word, Walter's heart breaks a little more. He listens intently, his chest tightening as he hears about the years of suffering his mother endured, living in poverty and isolation. Margaret's voice cracks as she describes the shame that kept her from searching for him, the fear that he had moved on, that he had forgotten her. She had believed that her son had no need for a mother who had lost herself. Tears well in Walter's eyes as he listens, his throat tightening as he struggles to keep his composure. He had spent years wondering what happened, imagining all the worst possibilities as everyone kept quiet, but never once did he give up hope. His voice shakes as he finally speaks, telling her through choked sobs that he never stopped looking. He never stopped searching for her, not even for a moment. Every success, every milestone in his life, had been marked by the absence of the one person he needed most, his mother. The room is filled with the soft sound of their tears. Walter, the powerful businessman who had built an empire, is reduced to a vulnerable child, weeping for the mother he thought he'd lost forever. Margaret reaches out, her hand trembling as she touches his face, wiping away his tears just as she had done when he was a little boy. It's a moment of raw tenderness, a reunion that transcends words. They both laugh softly through their tears, the relief of being together again overwhelming them. It is the kind of laughter that comes not from humor, but from the release of years of pent-up pain, a bittersweet sound that fills the room. Margaret, who had spent so many nights wondering if she would ever see her son again, now feels the warmth of his presence, the weight of her burdens lifting. For the first time in years, she feels at home. Walter, too, feels a profound sense of healing. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long is finally filled. In his mother's embrace, he finds the peace he has been searching for all his life. The office, usually a place of business, becomes a sacred space, a place where pain, regret, and sorrow give way to love, reconciliation, and the beginning of something new. In that day, amidst the echoes of their shared past, mother and son find each other again. And for the first time in decades, they feel whole. The best birthday present, you could say. 2 weeks passed, and Margaret, now more composed yet carrying the same quiet dignity, returned to Le Grand Étoile. The restaurant, bustling with the evening crowd, was just as grand and elegant as ever. But within its refined walls, one thing had remained the same: Simon. The same waiter, with the same dismissive air, still worked the floor. To him, Margaret was just another face from the lower rungs of society. Her worn coat and soft, aged face didn't belong in a place like this, at least not in Simon's eyes. As she approached, Simon's eyes caught her presence, and the same cold disdain that had greeted her before flickered across his face. He looked her up and down, his lips curling into the faintest sneer. To him, she was still the poor elderly woman who had no business being in such a high-class establishment. He didn't know. How could he? She was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, a bothersome reminder of a world he thought should stay far from the likes of Legrand Etoile. Simon's voice was sharp, barely masking the impatience beneath it. "What do you want today?" he asked, not bothering to hide his disinterest. Margaret, calm as ever, requested tea. Her tone was measured, polite, but Simon's response was curt, a dismissive nod as if fulfilling her request was an unbearable chore. As the night progressed, Simon's hasty, careless service led to an unfortunate mistake. While placing the hot tea before Margaret, his arrogance blinded him to the caution required. In his haste, his hand slipped slightly, and the steaming tea splashed across the table, soaking the front of Margaret's coat and scorching her skin. For a moment, there was silence. Margaret, though startled, remained composed, her face betraying only a flicker of pain. She didn't react as many might have expected. No outburst, no raised voice. She simply looked up at Simon, her eyes calm but resolute. With a voice that carried the weight of her years of suffering, she spoke firmly. "I'd like to see the manager, please." Simon's initial reaction was one of smug satisfaction. He believed, just like the last time, that this request would lead to nothing more than a minor disturbance, an annoyance that he could quickly brush off. In his mind, getting rid of her was the best outcome. He straightened, his lips pulling into a smirk, already imagining how the situation would play out. With a condescending air, he leaned in slightly, ready to dismiss her once again. But Margaret's unwavering gaze gave him pause, though he didn't let it show. Instead, Simon turned on his heel, believing that this would be the last time he'd have to deal with the troublesome woman. Without a second thought, he headed toward the back to call for Walter, the very man who had unknowingly set the stage for Simon's undoing. Simon had no idea that the woman he had twice insulted, twice dismissed, was not only the owner's mother, but the very heart of everything he was about to lose. The atmosphere in Legrand Etoile shifts the moment Walter steps into the dining area. His eyes fall on Margaret, the quiet pain etched across her face as she cradles her hand, freshly scalded by the hot tea Simon so carelessly spilled. It's as if the world stops for a second. The truth hits Walter like a wave, hard and fast. The woman sitting before him, the woman he had unknowingly treated with such care weeks ago, is his mother. He stands frozen for a beat, the enormity of the revelation sinking in. All those years of searching, all the sleepless nights spent wondering what happened to her, and now she's right here, sitting in his restaurant, hurt by one of his own staff. A powerful mix of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and protectiveness, washes over him, but it's the sorrow in her eyes that propels him forward. Walter's voice breaks the heavy silence, deep and commanding, cutting through the murmur of the patrons. "Simon," he says, his tone steady but carrying a weight that everyone feels. "What have you done?" Simon, still smug, turns toward Walter, his usual arrogance on full display. "Just taking care of a problem, sir," he replies, the condescension in his voice thick, oblivious to the storm he's about to walk into. But there's no more pretense, no more room for games. Walter's gaze narrows, and for the first time, everyone senses that something far deeper is at play. His words are sharp, unyielding. "That woman," he says, his voice growing firmer, "is my mother." A gasp ripples through the room. The patrons, who had been following the interaction with casual curiosity, now shift uneasily in their seats. Whispers spread like wildfire, shock overtaking the once tranquil atmosphere. Simon's smug expression falters, confusion knitting his brow, as if he hasn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Walter steps forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "The woman you've insulted, disrespected, and dismissed not once, but twice, is the very reason this restaurant exists. You think you're better than her? You, who claim to work in the service industry, but don't even understand what service means." Simon stumbles over his words, his confidence evaporating. I, I didn't know. You are white and she's black. I didn't mean, he stammers, but Walter cuts him off, his tone fierce but controlled. You didn't know because you never bothered to look beyond the surface, Walter says, his voice rising with each word. You judge her based on her appearance, her skin, her clothes, things you had no right to judge. And in doing so, you disrespected everything I've built this place to stand for. The weight of Walter's words hangs in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The patrons sit in stunned silence, witnessing a reckoning they didn't expect. There's no need for theatrics, no grand gestures. The power lies in the truth Walter delivers with such conviction. Le Grand Étoile isn't just a restaurant, Walter continues, his voice now softer, but no less impactful. It's a place built on respect, dignity, and kindness. It's a place that's supposed to make people feel welcome, no matter who they are or where they come from. And today you failed that. You failed her. Simon, pale and visibly shaken, tries to speak again, but the words don't come. His arrogance has been stripped away, leaving behind only fear and regret. He knows there's no excuse, no way to undo what he's done. The gravity of his actions finally dawns on him as he stands before the woman he treated so poorly, now realizing she holds far more power than he ever imagined. Without raising his voice, Walter delivers the final blow. You're fired, Simon, he says, the words clear and final. Gather your things and leave. You don't belong here anymore. The room is still, the tension thick as everyone processes what has just unfolded. Simon, trembling, glances around the room, searching for any sign of support, but finds none. His time at Le Grand Étoile has come to an abrupt, humiliating end. Slowly, he turns and walks away, his once inflated ego deflated completely. As Simon disappears, Walter turns to Margaret, his eyes softening with the love and regret he's carried for so long. The crowd is still silent, watching in awe as the realization settles. This isn't just a story of a fired employee. It's a story of a family reunited, of wounds long buried finally starting to heal. Margaret, her eyes brimming with tears, meets her son's gaze, and though no words are exchanged between them in that moment, the connection is undeniable. Walter had spent years searching for his mother, and now that she's here, he vows never to lose her again. As the patrons begin to stir, murmurs of disbelief and admiration ripple through the restaurant. Some begin to clap quietly, and soon the entire room is applauding, not just for Walter's stand against cruelty, but for the reunion they had unknowingly witnessed. The applause grows, swelling with emotion, as Walter stands beside his mother, the weight of the moment settling into every heart in the room. Justice, respect, and love, values that had always been at the core of Le Grand Étoile, are restored. And in that instant, everyone knows that this isn't just a restaurant. It's a home, a place where people are seen for who they truly are, and where dignity is non-negotiable. Word of the incident at Le Grand Étoile spread like wildfire, rippling across the city within hours. A single moment captured by an observant customer soon became a symbol of something much bigger. The video, which began as an ordinary diner's attempt to document a shocking confrontation, quickly morphed into a viral sensation. In it, people saw the power of justice served, not in courts or formal settings, but in a place where elegance and prejudice had clashed in the most unexpected way. What had begun as an everyday dinner service now became the talk of the town. News outlets eagerly picked up the story, framing it as more than just a scandal. It became a tale of redemption, of integrity, and of family reunion. Le Grand Étoile, once just a prestigious restaurant known for its exclusivity, now stood as a beacon of hope. The city marveled at how a single moment of confrontation had revealed the hidden heart of the establishment. Behind the scenes, though, the public frenzy felt far away from the quiet, intimate moments shared between Walter and Margaret. For the first time in decades, mother and son sat together, their years of pain and longing slowly mending with every conversation. No cameras captured these moments. No reporters knew of the quiet dinners they now shared, filled with laughter, tears, and stories of lost years. Margaret, long lost to the world, was finding her way back, this time with Walter beside her every step of the way. Margaret became more than just a survivor of her past. In the eyes of those who worked at and visited Le Grand Étoile, she was a symbol of grace and resilience. Her presence carried a silent dignity, a strength that could only come from years of suffering and healing. The staff began to know her as more than just Walter's mother. She became the heart of the restaurant itself, embodying the kindness and warmth that Le Grand Étoile had always aspired to offer. In time, Margaret's story would inspire others. As she walked through the restaurant, greeting staff and customers with a gentle smile, her quiet strength became a living testament to endurance and love. Her past no longer defined her. It was her future, with Walter by her side, that brought new life to their shared journey. Together, they rebuilt not only their relationship, but also the legacy of the restaurant. Le Grand Étoile, once merely a place of prestige, now carried with it a deeper meaning, a symbol of redemption, family, and the triumph of love over adversity. In this way, Walter and Margaret's story became part of the restaurant's legacy, silently enriching the lives of all who passed through its doors. And though the public knew only fragments of the tale, the bond between mother and son quietly strengthened, day by day, in the place that had unknowingly brought them back together. In the months following that fateful reunion, Le Grand Étoile flourished like never before. What had once been a beacon of fine dining became something far more meaningful, a place of connection, family, and redemption. The restaurant's success was no longer measured simply by its exclusive clientele or its high-class reputation. Instead, it thrived on a deeper, quieter strength, one that came from the reconnection between a mother and son, long separated by circumstances beyond their control. Walter, ever the entrepreneur, expanded the restaurant's reach. 2 new branches opened, each reflecting the same elegance and care that had made the original so beloved. But for all the growth, Walter remained grounded, his priorities clear. It wasn't just about expanding his business empire anymore. It was about restoring what had once been broken. And at the heart of this new chapter in his life was his mother, Margaret. Margaret, the once lost, now found matriarch of the family, became a constant presence at Le Grand Étoile. The staff respected her, not out of obligation, but because they saw in her the resilience of someone who had endured so much and yet carried herself with grace. Patrons, too, came to know her, and stories of her past spread quietly throughout the restaurant. She had become a symbol of the restaurant's transformation, her dignity and quiet strength a reflection of the journey both she and Walter had taken to find one another again. There was a peace now between mother and son, a silent understanding that years of suffering could not erase the bond they shared. Their conversations were often simple, their shared moments understated. And yet, there was healing in those moments, a gradual undoing of the pain they had carried for so long. One evening, as the day's rush began to settle, Walter and Margaret sat together in a quiet corner of the restaurant. The soft hum of distant conversations filled the air, but at their table, there was a comfortable silence. A simple meal lay before them, nothing extravagant, just enough to remind them of the simple joys of sharing food with someone you love. Margaret's eyes, tired but warm, glanced across the room. This place, once unfamiliar and overwhelming, had become a part of her. It wasn't just Walter's success she saw reflected in the polished walls and elegantly set tables. It was the story of their journey. The restaurant had once been a symbol of everything that had slipped through her fingers: family, love, security. But now, it had given her all of that back, and more. Walter, seated across from her, watched his mother with quiet pride. He no longer felt the weight of the years they had lost. Instead, he focused on the present, on the future they would build together. The wounds of the past had not disappeared, but they no longer defined them. They had been replaced with something stronger: love, forgiveness, and the unspoken promise that they would never be separated again. And so, as the evening drew to a close, Walter and Margaret sat in that quiet corner, sharing a meal that was about so much more than food. It was about time lost, time regained, and the time they still had together. Le Grand Étoile had not only brought them success, it had brought them home. And in that moment, all was as it should be. They didn't need words to express it. Their journey, painful and beautiful, had spoken for itself. The legacy of Le Grand Etoile was no longer just in its fine dining or prestigious reputation. It was in the love between a mother and son, finally reunited, and the healing that came when they found their way back to one another.